My hip keeps popping out, and when it does, my pain gets really bad and I have trouble walking. What can I do to make this stop happening? Hip subluxations and hypermobility are really common. I hear about them a lot. This is one I heard about recently as well. And with hip socket issues, so there's two areas that people refer to as their hips. One is their SI joint, which is more kind of like this back area and more like outside part of your hip bone. The second area is actually your hip joint. It's your hip socket. It's actually down here lower, so not up at your hip bone, but actually down lower in your leg. That's actually when the hip socket starts subluxing. Your hip is actually a very stable joint. Luckily, it's one of the more stable ones we have, but that doesn't mean it can't rub and shift in there, and it can pull on that labrum. You can get pinching, and typically hip socket pain is felt as growing pain. So usually if it's SI, it tends to be more on the outside. If it's actually your hip socket, it's more in that front groin area. Now there's a couple of really easy things you can do to make this more stable. One is stand equally on both feet. You gotta quit throwing your hip out, whether it's standing on one leg, doing the wraparound with your other leg, leaning on something. You've gotta get in the habit of keeping equal weight on both feet and on both hips, because that keeps them centered. When you're throwing that hip out of the socket, you're not doing yourself any favors trying to keep it from popping. A lot of times then you're just throwing body weight behind it and you're shearing that, shifting that out, so we don't want to do that. So you want to think about standing equally. Second thing, sitting. When you sit, you want to sit equal weight on both cheeks. You want to, same thing, avoid kind of shift into the side. I'm going to try and show you here. You want to avoid the crossing your legs, that leg hike. As you shift over to the side, you're pushing that hip out of the socket. And if you have true instability there and it's sliding around, that's the last thing you want to do, is be pushing that against that capsule. One, it's painful, and two, it gets easy for that to gradually shift, and then you go to get up and you can't hardly stand up because it's pinching so bad until you get it back in. Number three, sleeping. And I know I get a lot of questions and I see a lot of questions about problems and difficulties sleeping. So if you have not already, check your sleeping position and make sure that you're not doing that leg hike, not lying on your side, picking up that knee, pulling that over, because that becomes a huge issue in terms of torque and pull on that hip joint. So you want to keep your legs nice and even together. They can be bent straight anywhere in between, but try and make sure that they're staying together, and use a pillow between your knees. Using a pillow between your knees helps you to stabilize those hips. It kind of supports them because our knees are more narrow than our hips, and gives you a little bit more space and support for that. So you look at your sitting, standing, sleeping positions, and walking, okay? If you're somebody who, when you walk, you tend to throw your hip out, and a lot of times people don't even realize that they're doing it, then every time you take a step, you're pushing that hip to the edge of that joint. So we want to think about engaging our core, lightly engaging our glutes, and keeping more centered. If you need to, feel what your hips are doing. Put a hand on each hip, and then feel yourself when you walk. Are you able to stay nice and centered here? Or do you tend to find that you tend to shift out to the side every time you step down onto one leg? You can also use a mirror, use a reflection, get something to give you some feedback, because this is something that can be really hard to assess in yourself. Now, if you find that, oh my gosh, yeah, I do that all the time, but you have difficulty correcting it, well, start with just trying to adjust for what you can. It doesn't have to be everything all the time, but you have to be able to recognize it, and then when you do find you're doing it, at least try and keep yourself a little more stable, a little bit more in the center. And even if it's not perfect, that does not mean it's not going to be helpful. A lot of times, like I tell my people, if you can change 50%, you can a lot of times get rid of the majority of your symptoms, because your body has this great ability to manage issues. And you just have to create enough change that your body can heal up and manage what you have left. So don't feel like, oh, it has to be perfect all the time, but you do want to try and get rid of about 50% in all of those areas. So that way you're supporting that hip joint, you're giving that more stability and allowing that to kind of heal up and feel better. In a couple of weeks, you kind of recheck it and try and pull it back another 50%. And you keep working forward that way until you can get yourself out of symptoms. And of course, the pain is a big motivator, and so it's actually one of the best motivators. So see it as that. If you do something and it hurts, that is your cue and your call to change what you're doing, adjust that position, be a little bit more stable, and a lot of times that will lead to you feel better when you get up, out of a chair, you feel better when you get out of bed, and that hip doesn't pop and it's quite so painful. Now, the last piece with that is the popping. And so a lot of times when people have hip issues, their tendency is to try and pop it to make it feel better. If this is you, please look at adjusting that, because even though that makes you feel better in that moment, usually that moment doesn't last very long, and then you're back having to do it again and again. And the more you self-manipulate, the more you try and shift that joint, the sloppier that joint gets. So it doesn't mean that if you happen to stand up and it pops, that's bad. That's your body self-correcting, and usually it can handle doing its own thing a lot better than we can. What I want you to look at doing is paying attention to how often you're actually trying to get that joint to pop. And a lot of times it's more often than what we realize. For most of us, that becomes like this unconscious habit that we don't even realize that we're doing anymore unless it is a really big pain day. So if you're constantly shifting that, you gotta start getting rid of that. Again, try and drop it by 50%. So I'm not telling you can't ever do it. I'm telling you want to cut it back and get into the realm of on occasion and not every hour all day long. Look at those things with your position, look at moving, adjust and cut back your popping if that's something that you're doing, and those hips are going to start feeling better, more stable, and not slide around quite so much.